Hello and welcome to Play On, the Morgan Sports Law podcast. I'm Ben Cisneros, a trainee solicitor at Morgan Sports Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Donna Bartley, a senior associate at the firm. I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by two special guests, Nikki Dryden and Caradh O'Donovan. Nikki is a sports and human rights lawyer who works as an associate at the Australian Human Rights Institute and has recently been appointed as a board member of the Centre for Sport and Human Rights in Switzerland. Nikki is a double Olympian, having competed for Canada in swimming at 2 consecutive Olympics, and is currently undertaking a PhD focusing on the intersection of human rights and sport in the Olympic movement. Welcome, Nikki. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for having me.
Our second guest, Caradh, is a co-founder of Global Athlete, an independent athlete-led organisation representing the interests of athletes globally. She's also an ambassador for the charity Equity Sport and is a former kickboxing world champion. Thank you, Caradh, for accepting our invitation.
Thanks, Ben. I'm delighted to be on the podcast.
Well, in this episode, we'll be discussing Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter and the International Olympic Committee's approach to athletes' freedom of expression and right to protest ahead of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. With the Games just days away, this has been and still is a huge talking point that is likely to generate headlines over the coming fortnight. And if you haven't already, you might be interested to listen to our earlier episode on Rule 50 with human rights lawyer Brendan Schwab and US athlete Tiana Bartoletta. But much has changed since then. Rule 50.2 of the Olympic Charter states that no kind of demonstration or political, religious or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues or other areas. On its face, this amounts to a blanket ban on any form of demonstration or protest of a political, religious or racial nature. Indeed, that is the way it's been historically interpreted by the IOC. Its stated aims are to preserve the political neutrality of Olympic sport and the focus on the celebration of sporting performance. This rule has been subjected to no fewer than 3 sets of guidelines in the space of the past 18 months, setting out exactly when athletes may or may not demonstrate, protest or express their views, and explaining what will or will not happen to them if they do. In January 2020, the IOC guidelines made clear that any form of protest or demonstration at Olympic venues, including on the field of play, in the Olympic Village, during medal ceremonies and during the opening and closing ceremonies, was not allowed. Perhaps driven by the social changes the world has seen over the past year, particularly following the death of George Floyd, the IOC came under renewed pressure to reconsider its position. And 2 sets of guidelines and a somewhat dubious athlete questionnaire later, it's been conceded that athletes may express their views on the field of play prior to the start of competition under certain conditions. However, the IOC also seems to have abandoned the distinction between expressing one's views and demonstrating or protesting. It now seems that even simply expressing an opinion or belief will not be permitted during ceremonies, competition, or in the Olympic Village. This is an issue that refuses to go away and which, along with the many issues relating to COVID-19, threatens to overshadow the Games. I think that's quite enough from me. So, Nikki, if I could start with you, where do you stand on Rule 50.2 and the way it's set to be applied in Tokyo?
Yeah, I think what's very disappointing is that the IOC has really failed to understand that this is a human rights issue. None of their language around the guidelines, none of their language, even in the consultations with athletes, use human rights language. And that's what's the most disappointing because they've really failed and missed the mark completely. I really want to talk about freedom of expression. They want to talk about a rule that they have. And really, freedom of expression is one of the most important human rights there is because it enables you to then express other human rights. So that my big concern really is about the way it's been framed by the International Olympic Committee and that they've really missed the mark, which is disappointing because, they have made some progress towards human rights strategy. And this is their first big test and they failed.
And Caradh, what about you? Where do you stand?
Well, I think I'd echo everything that Nikki has just said there. I totally disagree with the rule, and I guess I always have. I think fundamentally it's a freedom of expression issue that is, as Nikki mentioned, a really important human right. And I just cannot understand why any sports organisation can think that they have the right to just change that. So these are sports rules that we're talking about, and they shouldn't even have they shouldn't even be in the same conversation as human rights issues. We can't just change the UN Declaration of Human Rights because a sports organisation thinks it's convenient. So I totally disagree with it. And I suppose we will talk about it in a bit more detail. I'm not at all impressed with the changes that they allege they've made.
Well, that's certainly something we'll come on to. Donna, was there anything you wanted to add on the sort of overarching perspective?
I think I would just echo what Nikki and Caradh have said, to say that it's failed to view this as a freedom of expression issue. The latest guideline talks about extending further opportunities for freedom of expression, but these are things that should just be guaranteed. So, I'm sure we'll come on to some more of the specifics, but I would certainly echo what Caradh and Nikki have said.
Yeah. One of the main ways in which the IOC has come to these latest guidelines, which is something we will discuss in a bit more detail, it is via consultation with athletes. And that's another thing that they've sort of stressed in the communications recently. Caradh, maybe if I come to you first on this, do you think that this athlete consultation adds any credibility to their position?
Well, I guess, first of all, it's a really difficult one to speak on, because as athletes and as athlete groups, it's something we've been crying out for quite a long time, to have more consultation and to have a bigger voice. And so I kind of feel that the Olympics have used this and said, well, we're going to put this on the athletes here. So no, I don't agree with the consultation process. I think it's been dragged out over the past year because, as you mentioned already, they've come under so much pressure around this rule. And I feel that the survey process, I mean, from a global athlete point of view, we've had it independently reviewed. It doesn't cut it really. It's flawed. It's leading, that's, I suppose, one conversation. But again, it comes back down to a very, very simple issue. It's a human rights issue. A survey shouldn't be anywhere near it. It shouldn't decide whether we're going to give you your human rights or we're not going to give you your human rights. So I think the consultation process, as well as it being flawed, it wasn't really appropriate to use it in this issue. And I kind of feel a little bit, it's a difficult one because, we can't just, I suppose, when we're crying out for athlete consultation and athlete voice, and then we criticize the one time that they really do a big exercise on this, it's a tricky one. But I suppose the bottom line is it's not appropriate to use surveys in this particular instance, I don't think.
Nikki, would you agree with that?
Yeah, Caradh summed it up very well. I think that it is difficult because it is something that the IOC Athletes Commission is starting to gain more power and a voice within the International Olympic Committee itself, and that's a wonderful thing. But what I fear is that this was an exercise in potentially using the athlete voice against us. Caradh mentioned the leading questions. I did take the survey as a retired Olympian. I was sent a link to take the survey. I took the survey, I screenshotted every question. I analyzed it as I was going. And, without providing context before you take a survey like that, and then having leading questions, of course, athletes are going to say that they would be offended, if someone did something offensive. I mean, that's kind of the type of question that was there, which is just like absurd. There was absolutely no human rights language or education that went along with this survey. So if you don't know what your rights are, how are you going to know how to answer these types of questions? And then even in the way it was summarized, I actually did go through all the survey results, and, the IOC led with what was answers that, supported their rule. But they failed to summarize other questions that actually said that 63% of athletes would exercise their freedom of expression or would not be opposed to other athletes doing so. 63%, when they don't even know really the rules, they don't really know what the consequences are. That's a really high number, and I'm quite happy with that number. The only other thing I'd say about the consultation process in terms of the athletes that were consulted, we saw really high numbers of athletes from China and Russia participating. But the reflection was that they weren't Olympians. And I'm not saying only Olympians should have taken the survey. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of people that weren't Olympians until this summer, or this, coming up in Tokyo, that, potentially are in that elite athlete group. But in China, only 29% of the athletes surveyed were Olympians. 71% were elite athletes. I mean, who are these people that are actually being asked questions that really are reflective and important on the Olympic athlete, as opposed to other top athletes that might be in the country. So, not a good exercise in stakeholder consultations.
I think that there's some really important points. And Donna, I'd just like to pick up on something Caradh said with you, and I wonder if you have a take on it about the appropriateness of using a survey in this context, because ultimately a lot of the issues around freedom of expression and protesting at the Olympics are to do with sort of the rights of minorities ultimately, and is using a survey, which is, inherently to do with seeking a majority or seeking the popular opinion. Is that sort of compatible with the issue of human rights?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was going to say. That a survey.
Sorry for stealing your point.
No, absolutely. A survey in this sort of circumstances just seems totally inappropriate, because when you look at the ways in which these freedom of expression has been used and arguably sort of protests that have taken place, that's all. It's very frequently been about looking at protecting marginalised groups and minorities, and how you can hope to get those views from a survey. I just don't know, and I don't have confidence that those voices will be protected by the results of a survey.
Yeah, sorry. One more thing, I think, to jump on what Donna said, is that I don't necessarily know that the survey was anonymous. There's probably ways to figure out who was responding. A unique ID was sent to me. I don't know if I would feel super safe if I was an athlete from Ethiopia, from a minority group protesting something. I don't know that I would feel totally safe in answering that. So it's one thing for a retired athlete. I have all the privilege in the world to be able to voice my opinion, but current athletes may not have felt that safe.
Moving on to the detail of the rules, we mentioned at the outset that the primary aim of the rule is about preserving political neutrality. If an athlete at Tokyo was to take the knee, for example, or to show solidarity with the LGBT plus community on the podium, which is, apparently not allowed, is this something that would be a breach of Rule 50.2? Or is there scope for saying these things aren't political protests? Is the rule really trying to capture these sorts of expressions? Nikki, maybe I could come to you with that first.
Well, I would argue no. So I would say that those things are totally fine and they fit within Rule 50.2 as it exists. I think part of the problem, though, is Rule 50.2 and the consequences of Rule 50.2 are totally vague, and we actually don't know. And everyone that's done something before has been treated differently. In Australia, we have Cathy Freeman, who ran with the Aboriginal flag and the Australian flag around her neck after winning a Sydney Olympic gold medal. 12 years later in London, an Aboriginal boxer from Australia wore an Aboriginal t-shirt in the ring in warm-up, and he was publicly shamed by the Australian Olympic Committee. So two Aboriginal athletes, both treated differently. Cathy had been treated badly previous to that, but because the way the Olympic Committee interacted with their behavior. So I think that, we just really don't know in that sense, how it's going to unfold. But my first argument would definitely be all of those things are totally okay.
But is it your understanding that the IOC has a differing view?
Well, I don't know, because other people have done it and they haven't been penalized. So we actually don't know what a Rule 50.2 violation is. We kind of think that maybe what, Smith and Carlos did is, but Cathy Freeman, wore an Aboriginal flag. Nothing happened to her. Athletes cross themselves. I mean, I would love to count how many times an athlete crosses themselves before they enter the field of play in an international competition. I mean, if we counted how many times at the World Cup, I mean, we would run out of numbers. So there are constant religious demonstrations that are happening, and nothing really happens. So, it's possible that they are interpreting those things the same way I would, that they are not political protests or racial propaganda, and that in fact they are, those athletes are exercising their human rights to freedom of expression. But if there's this much talk about it and these many guidelines, I think that's probably not correct.
Donna, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I would just say that we also know that there's potentially going to be a different approach between national or international governing bodies and potentially the IOC. For example, we know that FINA has said, obviously, with the extension of freedom of expression, that is now going to include the field of play. So, for example, GB women's football team has said that they will be taking the knee before their matches. But FINA, the international governing body for swimming, has said that they would expect the rules to extend to what they class as their field of play. So they won't allow any form of protest, shall we say, to take place on their field of play. So I guess we just don't know how it's going to go. Obviously, we know in that situation, the IOC wouldn't have a problem with it, but FINA would. So, yeah, it will be interesting to see how it plays out.
And picking up on another potential distinction that you sort of touched on there, Donna, is whether certain acts or gestures might be construed as a protest or a demonstration, and some things not. Where's the line between simply expressing one's view and demonstrating or protesting, or is there a line at all? I don't know if either of you would like to address that.
Yeah, well, exactly. it's impossible. Well, perhaps impossible to draw the line, and so the focus should be about the freedom of expression. And obviously, that's not totally unlimited. There are restrictions in the way that you are allowed to, under international law and national laws, express what you have to say. So. But yeah, it's very difficult to draw that line, and obviously it's difficult to say what is just expressing your views and what becomes political.
Nikki, is there anything you've picked up from the IOC that might indicate where they would draw the line?
Well, I thought it was interesting, and this is something that I kind of had missed in my most recent analysis that I did last week, but one of the good things that came out of the Athletes Commission consultations was they actually did go back to the IOC and say, hey, we want some guidelines on the due process. How is this actually going to unfold and play out at the Olympics? I didn't think they had responded, but they did. I missed that. On July 2nd, they issued their third set of or the 15th set of guidelines, if you will. It's 5 pages, but there's really only 1 page of important information. And they do talk about this disciplinary consequences by the IOC, and that they will take into account whether the expression constituted advocacy subject to prohibition under international human rights law. I think I know where they got that language from, some of us, such as hatred that constitutes incitement to violence, etc. So they do actually refer to this idea that not all freedom of expression is free, that there are limits, and that so in a way they actually are saying, if you do one of those things, so let's say the Nazi salute, right? Or, a gun to the head, or, something that's quite violent against somebody, that they're going to target that. So it was kind of like, I thought, am I actually reading this right? Are they actually acknowledging that they won't penalize people who do the opposite of that? I mean, the fact that I have to read through all the lines, just come out and say it. Just come out and say, we support freedom of expression as it is in international human rights law. If there is a problem, it'll be because somebody, violates, international norms. But they didn't do that. But there's something there that I think might give us some insight into how they might behave.
Certainly very vague and something that, it may only come out in the fullness of time. Although I would note that in their initial guidance, they drew a distinction, as I mentioned at the outset, between expressing one's view and gestures such as kneeling, implying that kneeling would be seen as a demonstration or protest, whereas other things might not be. And that, I guess, again, that just goes back to the vagueness point. Caradh, if I could just bring you in, what sort of global athletes' perspective on the issue of what might count as a protest? Is there any advice that you're giving to athletes about how they should navigate this issue?
Well, I guess we would hope that athletes wouldn't be deterred from following what they believe to be right, whether it's social justice or whatever issue that they may feel that they have to demonstrate. We'd certainly be open to supporting any athlete as best we could if that was the case. But I think from just listening to all of you discuss this in the last couple of minutes, the lack of clarity around any potential punishment, it would lead me to suspect, this is me personally, that they may be reluctant to punish athletes. Now, I could be wrong. I think we're going to see it tested. I believe that people will protest and will push this rule to the limit, and I suppose we'll see from there. But my absolute view on this is that the Olympics are on the wrong side of history again on this. They're using this rule and kind of packaging the whole changes as this great PR piece, and just hoping it deters athletes. But I'm not sure they're going to be able to enforce whatever punishment they make up as they go along, because we still don't really know what that's going to be. And I think if they do, and again, I'm no legal expert, you guys will be the legal experts on this. Can it be challenged, and will it be ultimately enforced? I'm not so sure.
Well, that question of whether the rules can be challenged is certainly something that I'd like to pick up on a little bit later. But just coming back to the aims of Rule 50.2, does the stated aim of preserving political neutrality at the Olympics hold any water? Caradh, maybe I could come to you with that.
No, that's the straight answer. I mean, I suppose, in my opinion, the Olympics are the most political organisation or sports organisation going. I mean, everything about it is just inherently political. So for them to then, we use this rule to, I suppose, pretend or fool us all into thinking that they're this politically neutral organisation, it's laughable. I mean, a typical example, why does President Thomas Bach meet heads of states? I mean, if they're not political, he has no business meeting these people. So we look to the past Olympic Games. We've had countries boycotting each other's Olympic Games. We have the US, the Soviet Union in the Cold War. I mean, you could go on and on, really. So I think on paper, yes, they say they're politically neutral. But I mean, the reality is totally different.
Nikki, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, if the Olympics are not political, then why do we represent our country? I mean, then don't have a medal ceremony. I mean, the medal ceremony with flags coming down and singing national anthems is the most political thing I can think of. I can't think of any other more profound way to express your nationality and your, what politics that you represent than doing that. And again, like in Australia, I'm sorry to go back to it, but the Aboriginal flag in Australia, there's two. There's an Aboriginal and a Torres Strait Islander flag. Those are federally recognized flags of Australia. So why cannot those be raised at the Olympics? Someone has made a decision that when an Australian athlete wins, the Union Jack flag, I don't know what it's called, but it's got the Union Jack on it, that shall be raised. So this idea that we are trying to preserve political neutrality is silly. If you are going to prohibit a certain type of freedom of expression, you might be able to have a legitimate purpose. So in Australia, the law is a little bit different than in the United States, something I'm learning. Everyone looks to the United States as this beacon of free speech, but even in America, free speech can be curtailed, right? And in Australia, it's sort of this idea that you can have a legitimate purpose behind your law, but if it's not proportional and adapted and appropriate to the situation, then you can't do it. And so, if the IOC has a legitimate purpose, which is trying to, have this magical moment, okay, that's great. But there's other ways for them to do it. And talking about human rights would be the first way to do it. And providing actual guidelines for expressing your human rights, that would be appropriate. And then people might go, oh, I get it now, because you're saying that the purpose is that we're all trying to promote this universal ideal of oneness or whatever it might be. And the best way to do that is for me to just be who I am on the podium or something like that. I mean, there are ways that you could do it, but just, going under your bed sheets and pretending that it doesn't exist is not the right way to go about it.
And so, Donna, would you say that perhaps the IOC are somewhat hypocritical when it comes to Rule 50?
Yeah, I think so. As Caradh said, that the IOC can't say that it's completely apolitical in certain situations, but it seems obviously when it comes to the athletes that they're not, entitled to express their point of view on things. But I would just add that some of these issues, perhaps ought not to be viewed as political. And I would question whether we want the Olympics to remain neutral on certain issues. So, for example, things like racial injustice, I don't know that it's good enough to be neutral on that issue. It's the sporting events that we've had recently with the Euros and in football, obviously they are, saying that it's important to promote racial justice and, have an equal game or however it is they've decided to do that. It's not good enough to stay silent or neutral on those issues. So would like to see the Olympics do the same thing. We've also seen the NBA in America say that they are committed to addressing social injustice. So, those things are good for sport and the wider purpose of bringing people together. As Nikki says, it's important to show you can be who you want to be, and that's what brings people together and, would be a good thing to demonstrate at the Olympics. So in some instances, really, neutrality just doesn't cut it anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, and just to jump on that, and Donna, you referred to this earlier as well, is the idea that freedom of expression, as I said, is an enabling right. And the International Olympic Committee, as do all the nation states that attend the Olympics and are part of the Olympic family, they have additional positive obligations under international law to provide an opportunity for minorities and women to express their voices and have in the media and in other places. And so this additional obligation actually creates a thing that is, you're right, it's not political. This is actually an affirmative obligation that the International Olympic Committee has to allow a special place for women and minorities to be able to speak their voices. So what better place than on the Olympic podium or after a race? I mean, this is exactly what, the conventions on the elimination of racial discrimination, the conventions on Indigenous peoples, the conventions on, elimination of discrimination against women. That's what all of this is about. It's about affirmative action and creating opportunities and having those additional obligations to create those opportunities for people to speak up.
It certainly does seem that the IOC are becoming the odd one out when it comes to this issue. Caradh, if I could come to you on that point about, the moment of the athlete, which was referenced by Nikki and Donna, I think. If you just won a medal at the Olympics, would you really be troubled by the fact that one of the other medal winners chose to use their moment to peacefully stand up for something they believe in? And do you think that many athletes would be troubled by this?
Well, I'd say, first of all, if it was me, absolutely not. It wouldn't make any difference to whether I won an event or I didn't win it. If I'm getting my medal, I'm getting my medal. Nobody can really do anything to take that away. And I'd like to think that athletes, for the most part, will be supportive of that. Obviously, not everybody will. Some people feel that, this is their moment and, they might not necessarily agree with the demonstration on the podium beside them. But ultimately, it's, for me personally, it's none of my business. It's not my business to tell anyone else how they express what they want to express, what they want to say. And I think that's what the Olympics are doing here. They're still telling athletes how and when they can speak. And when we look at athletes winning medals, and while it is, a huge moment to get to the Olympic Games, it's a once in a lifetime, maybe two in a lifetime for some athletes. It's, certainly very few people make it there. To win a medal would be even, fewer again. But I think you have to ask yourself as an athlete that, because I want an extra 30 seconds or 5 minutes of joy of my medal, do I have the right to rewrite human rights? And I don't think anybody, when you look at that objectively, would say yes. I'd like to hope they wouldn't. So personally, it would make no odds to me. I suppose, and Nick, you referred to this earlier, having more awareness or education around what human rights are. When I think every athlete is fully aware of that, they might just look at things a little bit more objectively and just think, well, I still have my medal. And if somebody wants to highlight a really important, for example, social justice cause beside me, well, that's their human right to do that.
Absolutely. We've spoken quite a lot so far about the uncertainty. So I'd now like to bring it back to the point about potential disciplinary consequences for athletes and whether these might be challenged. So firstly, is there any real certainty on how an athlete might be sanctioned? I think we've already slightly touched on that, for breaching Rule 50.2 at Tokyo. And then if disciplinary proceedings were to be brought, do you think that the charges and or the rule itself might be vulnerable to a legal challenge? Nikki, I'll come to you on that one.
So I might start with the second part first, because I hope so. I mean, this is what I'm planning for, and this is what, there are coalitions and groups and lawyers all ready, to go at this from a human rights point of view. So, if the IOC wants to go for this, we are ready. And we are ready to present the international human rights argument and, the IOC's obligations under international law. They're an observer member of the United Nations, so they're legally obligated to follow UN treaty. So it's pretty straightforward for me in that sense. To your first point about the process, so I used to think the process was really implemented through the National Olympic Committee, and I think it still is to an extent, right? So the athlete signs their athlete agreement. In the athlete agreement, they agree to be bound by the Olympic Charter. And that's how the IOC actually reaches down into the nation state and takes jurisdiction over individual citizen athletes. And so it's that sort of private legal contract that is kind of going to govern. And so what you're going to have now is the USOPC, the US National Olympic Committee, has said, well, we're not going to put that in our athlete agreement. So already we have major problems for the IOC when NBC, the crown jewel of the Olympic movement, decides to air an American athlete doing a racial or social justice protest. They are not going to be disciplined by the USOPC. So what is the IOC going to do? I don't know. Now, I used to think it was very much NOC specific to the IOC and that sort of relationship. But as Donna mentioned, FINA's recent coming out saying, no, we control the field of play, and that includes the pool deck. My fear in that sense is that somebody does something and FINA's executive committee says, well, you can't race in the next race. The gun goes off and the race is gone and that athlete is standing on the pool deck. There will be no due process in that hypothetical. So I really want to make sure athletes understand that timing is everything here. There are people out there to help you. Reach out to Caradh or myself or Donna or Ben, and we will connect you to the right people. We can help you talk through this in terms of timing, because I think it is very unclear and there are risks that because the due process is not going to be followed and there's not much we can do after the fact if you're just kept out of your competition. So I think that's something, it's really important to get that message out. The timing of this will be really important, especially because we don't know it, the fact that it's going to be different for every athlete from every country and every sport is just, that's a disaster. It's an embarrassment.
Just finally, if I may just add, we are a couple of days away from the opening ceremony in Tokyo 2020, and we still have this huge lack of clarity as to what the punishments are going to be, if any. Will it differ from sport to sport, from athlete to athlete, from each country? And that is just simply not good enough. The rule itself is ridiculous, but when we have this rule and they've done this consultation process and they've had all of these months to come up with it, and that they still can't even decide what exactly the next steps are going to be, it's outrageous from the Olympics. It's just not good enough. And they really, just need to get their acts together.
They have better detailed guidelines if you make a COVID breach. So if you breach the COVID protocols, like not wearing a mask or not following guidance from a COVID officer, they have more detailed guidelines on how the discipline will unfold than they do on this issue. So, that to me says it all. That they've spent more time thinking about somebody not wearing a mask, which is important, don't get me wrong, than they have about this issue that athletes have been raising with them for decades.
And do you think that lack of clarity around the due process in itself could give rise to a legal challenge, perhaps?
Yes, for sure. So, one of the things that sport and human rights movement have been spending a lot of time on and talking about is this idea of remedy. What is the grievance mechanism that is in place for a particular sport dispute or a human rights abuse that unfolds, whether it's sexual abuse or freedom of expression or, something else, a right to work. These are all things that have to have a remedy. There has to be a process for grieving somebody who's lost their human rights or had them abused or not protected or respected. And so this is quite front and center. This is something the IOC knows about. They've gone through their human rights strategic framework, so they should know about remedy and remedial action. And this is also something that's required under international standards. So yes, for sure. Threats and innuendos saying we're going to take your medals away, erase you from the record books and take all the money we gave you back, that's not due process.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up then, I'd just like to come to each of you and ask what perhaps your expectations and your hopes for Tokyo are with respect to Rule 50. What do you expect is going to happen and what do you hope is going to happen? And Caradh, I'll come to you first.
Well, I suppose these games are happening and I hate to use the phrase because it's been used so much, but it is unprecedented. And I think there's just so much other stuff between coronavirus and everything just around these games. But if we, I suppose, look specifically to this rule, you can see the unrest from a lot of athletes about it. So I definitely think we're going to see some form of athlete protest and demonstration in the areas that they have been told that they can't do it. So I suppose if that happens, my hope is that athletes will be as well informed as they can be about, I suppose, their rights and that they'll know where the supports are to go. And I also hope that the Olympics, I'm not confident on this, but I do hope the Olympics, maybe the penny will drop and they'll realize that they want to be on the right side of history and they'll do the right things and allow athletes their right to freedom of expression.
Nikki, what about you?
I would echo that. I really hope that the IOC understands the consequences of getting this wrong, and that they will be on the wrong side of history, that it will create way more attention. If they want to keep this quiet, the last thing on earth they should do is discipline an athlete for making a social or racial justice demonstration. So I'm really hopeful that the IOC will see the error of their ways and come to the light. I'm 100% that an American athlete will do something. I think that that's probably a guarantee. And that's just because there are so many athletes there who feel very confident. They feel like they were engaged by their National Olympic Committee. They were heard. There's a really clear process for what is and isn't allowed, which I think is something that I don't know why the IOC couldn't do that. The USOPC did it with a Racial and Social Justice Committee. So it's very clear if you're an American athlete what the rules are to an extent. So we will see athletes from America do this. And so I'm excited to see what happens because I would be so proud of them for them exercising their human rights. And I hope we see athletes from other countries doing it. There are people out there who want to help you. So, obviously it's a huge decision and it's up to every individual athlete. It's also, it might forget, like in the heat of the moment, you might have planned something and then you get up there and you just like the tears are falling and that's amazing, and that's an amazing expression of like the culmination of a life's journey. So I just want people to live their best lives and be their true self, and any way that we can support them, we will.
And Donna, I suppose last word to you on this. What do you think we might see and what do you hope will happen?
Well, I would echo what Nikki and Caradh have said. I think we will see some demonstrations or expressions of people's views. I'm totally expecting that. I really hope, as Nikki says, that people from other countries will do it as well if they feel that that's the right thing to do, to express their views on a particular issue. So I'm expecting the rule to be tested by the IOC and perhaps by other governing bodies, international governing bodies. But I'm hoping that they'll take a sensible approach to that and consider their obligations under human rights law when doing so. Absolutely.
Well, I think one thing's for sure is that the sports legal community will be watching on with great interest. Well, that's probably all we have time for today. Thank you very much, Nikki and Caradh, for giving us your time and for such an interesting discussion. If there are any athletes who are concerned by Rule 50 and its impact on the upcoming Olympics, then please do feel free to reach out to us at Morgan Sports Law or to Caradh at Global Athlete or Nikki. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do rate, review and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget to check out our earlier episode on Rule 50 with Brendan Schwab and Tiana Bartoletta. For information about Morgan Sports Law and for articles about athletes' rights issues, please visit www.morgansl.com. And if you'd like to join our mailing list or if there are any topics you'd like to suggest for a future episode, please email us at podcast@morgansl.com. And finally, please do connect with us on social media at Morgan Sports Law on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and Facebook for articles, update and news. Thank you for listening and we hope you'll join us again soon.